Anindita ji, I will focus attention on the globalism and international.
Dr. Karan Singh, Shri N. Vora, President IIC, Dr. Swan, Shri Shyam Saran, Life Trustees of IIC, ladies and gentlemen. I extend a very hearty welcome to Dr. Karan Singh, Shri N. Vora, Dr. Swan, Shri and Shri Shyam Saran. I also extend a special welcome to Dr. Oscar Pujol, Director of Cervantes Institute, who has started his second inning in Delhi. I also extend a very warm welcome to Dr. Anindita, Balslev, author of the book CrossCultural Conversation, A New Way of Learning, which is going to be released today. The center has had a very long and close association with Dr. Anindita Balslev. In January 2006, she was responsible for conceptualizing and coordinating a very insightful conference called Towards Greater Human Solidarity, Options for a Plural World. This conference was organized by IIC in collaboration with India Habitat Center and was highly acclaimed for its quality of deliberations. Dr. Balslev is a highly respected philosopher based both in India and Denmark. She has lived in India, France, US and Denmark in pursuit of her educational and professional excellence, which inspired her to create a forum for cross-cultural conversation, which is called CCC. The CCC conferences that she regularly organizes have led to many thought-provoking discussions and publications. I also extend a very hearty welcome to all of you, ladies and gentlemen. May I now invite Dr. Karan Singh to formally release the book Cross-Cultural Conversation, A New Way of Learning, authored by Dr. Balslev, and to conduct the further proceedings. Dr. Karan Singh ji, please.
Okay, let's release the book. Would you like to stand up? Voraji, as president of the IIC, it doesn't look good that you sit in one corner. So you say, oh, please, come on, after this. No, no. Shri N. Vora, president of India International Center. Kapil is not here. Trustee Shyam Saran. Director Shri Vastav, Oscar Pujol of the Cervantes Institute, our author Anindita Balslev, and friends. I must commend Dr. Balslev for having, in her book Cross-Cultural Conversation, covered many of the prominent issues that humanity faces in the second decade of the 21st century. Globalization versus nationalism. Science versus religion, single identities versus multiple identities, single face versus the interface movement, social harmony versus social conflict. There are many paradoxes that we face, and she has postulated cross-cultural conversations as a methodology of trying to bridge these paradoxes. We have two very distinguished panelists today. We have Shri Shyam Saran, Trustee, IIC, very distinguished diplomat. I remember when he was Foreign Secretary, he used to give us brilliant presentations to the rather critical Parliamentary Committee on External Affairs. And Dr. Pujol, who apparently is returned after an absence of 7 years to the Cervantes Institute. What I'm going to, I suggest the following. I suggest that Dr. Balslev first speaks about her work, followed by Dr. Pujol, and then Shri Shyam Saran. And in the end, if necessary, I'll make a few closing remarks. So may I suggest that a maximum of 20 minutes each for the speakers. Is that all right?
Yes.
So, Dr. Balslev, you are on first. They have the option to speak from here or to speak from there.
I prefer to stand.
Namaskar. I'm extremely pleased that so many distinguished people are already all here despite the pollution, despite our traffic problem.
And despite odd and even.
Well, prior to saying a few words about the vision and the aspiration that CCC as a project entails, let me first express my thanks to the Jawaharlal Nehru Memorial Fund for the Nehru Fellowship in support of writing, and to Routledge for publishing this book. I have a very special thanks to give to the India International Center for various reasons, to which I return at the end. Let me at first mention that CCC is an abbreviation for cross-cultural conversation that I use as an umbrella term. CCC is not meant as a designation exclusively for a conversation between huge aggregates of cultures, for which the conventional practice is to use such nomenclatures as East and West, or even for that matter, North and South. CCC is very much an invitation to an open exchange among groups and subgroups that are located in the center and periphery of any given societal scenario with reference to cultural practices in any national or international setting. In other words, if we now ask, while speaking of cross-cultural conversation, what is it that we are seeking to cross, and whom are we expecting to meet on the other side by engaging ourselves in this endeavor? The answer lies in becoming aware of the fact that every time the we and they categories are used in multiple socio-historical contexts, there is an implied sense of boundary, overtly or covertly, that is operative. These boundaries are drawn with the help of any imaginable criterion that calls for group formations, such as race, religion, gender, nationality, ethnicity, and many, many more. Indeed, we not only can, but we, as a matter of fact, do keep inventing these criteria for group formations for various cultural purposes. Boundary, let us keep in mind, boundary is only a metaphor. And as I have discussed in this book, this metaphor can be used both in a soft and a hard sense. The soft sense of the metaphor is where boundary implies only a border that distinguishes, that enables us to claim our distinctiveness while acknowledging and validating diversity and differences in the multi-layered cultural milieu in which we live. But in the hard sense, boundary signifies a barrier where crossing is, as it were, trespassing. So what CCC as a project seeks to bring about is some alterations in the dynamics of the self and the other by asking whether it is possible for us to soften some of the hard boundaries. And this is all with the aim of ameliorating the quality of our collective lives. Given that today we all are by and large living in a system of nation-state, I should say a nation-state system of governance, and vying for a common sharing of advanced scientific technology, there is a crucial need to engage in CCC for various reasons. In this book, I particularly focus on the urgency of having an open public discourse on the themes of religious identity and nationality, since it is along these lines, more than anything else, that humanity seems to be divided into the largest aggregates, leading to the erection of hard boundaries in a precarious manner. As we watch, what do we see? We find that in the global scene, many nations today are slowly becoming multi-religious in their demographic composition, and world religions are increasingly becoming transnational. Under such circumstances, more public conversation on a range of issues connected in association with these themes that are of deep cultural concerns, I believe, might manifest a minimal sense of solidarity in diversity, which is badly needed in the multiple levels of exchanges and interactions that we are having worldwide. This may also persuade us to unlearn some of our prejudices that we have about the otherness of others, which have been there on the collective level and handed down from generation to generation. Now is an opportunity, through this conversation, that we get rid of some of these prejudices. Interested readers will come across several examples in this book demonstrating why we must learn to sustain some kind of a balance among our multiple social identities that often seem to clash. All these call for channelizing some intellectual and economic resources in order to empower societies, and not merely at any cost the state apparatus alone. While speaking of the thrust of the Indian civilization, and perhaps for indicating the wisdom that is embedded in it, our great poet Rabindranath Tagore said that Indian civilization has never been Rashtra-kendrik, it is Samaj-kendrik. This process of reflection provokes us actually to go and look deeper into the various abuses that are there from a wrong coupling of knowledge and power. These we find all over. And actually, many of the most cherished human values often seem to be cast aside in the service of a nation-state system of governance that stands guard over hard boundaries. Chomsky, for example, had expressed this predicament pointedly when he said that just as scientific knowledge of how to grow better crops, when supported by a government in its nation-building efforts, may lead to a rapid development of technology with the aim of implementing that knowledge. Theoretical knowledge, how to implement that. This is possible when the government helps. But again, the same technical intelligentsia can rapidly and readily convert that enterprise into a crop-destroying activity in a foreign land if the state policy is geared toward vanquishing an enemy nation. I recall Chomsky cited the example of Vietnam as an example where he said science and scientific ethics were corrupted in the service of a state power. Today we know there is no dearth of examples of these such abuses, of a wrong coupling of knowledge and power. Let me also add here that as members of any society, not only Indian society, any society, that we have to be aware of this abuse of knowledge. Knowledge of social science, for example, can help an abusive government to devise dubious forms of social engineering in order to control resistance, insurgencies, and even simply for curbing any pertinent voice of dissent. For a greater public awareness with regard to all these intricate issues, we really need to make some effort in order to narrow the gap between the academia and the society at large. I have therefore suggested, and not only in this book but all along, that the participants of the CCC must always come from within as well as outside the academia. There are many intricate issues here, but as the time constraints, I cannot go into that. But then you have the book. If you care, if you're curious, you will have to find a whole chapter devoted to these questions. From what I have said so far, it probably is evident that the idea of CCC has been on my mind for a long, long time. I did write a number of essays and several concept notes for conferences, specially designed to draw speakers from multiple disciplines and various walks of life. And I'm happy to tell you that some of these concept notes actually have given rise to conferences, and I'm happy about that. CCC calls for collaboration. This is not a one person's job, nor is it a monocultural project. I formally held the first CCC International Conference in Denmark, and the first volume was published in the Cultural Criticism series of the American Academy of Religion in 1995, almost a quarter of a century ago. I always wished that that at least as a major venue for the CCC enterprise, we will have India, where the cultural soil is inundated virtually from time immemorial with a philosophy of globalism, not born out of any political expediency. This is a great soil for doing CCC. Now, to cut a long story short, it was in 2006, as the director told you, it was IIC, in partnership with the India Habitat Center, hosted the first CCC International Conference in New Delhi. The presence of Dr. Kapila Vatsyayan, I do not see her, I was told she's coming, and the support from Raj Libahan, who was the director of the India Habitat Center then, made all the difference, and I really thank them. But apart from that first CCC conference, I also had the opportunity to organize 3 more international conferences here in New Delhi on the basis of CCC concept notes that I wrote, all alone, sitting somewhere else. Now, it is a great joy that apart from that first conference, Dr. Karan Singh, whom, as you know, among many other things, has served as a long-time past president of the India International Center, was present in all the 3. I would like to thank you for all your valuable contribution. It was in 2010 that I organized a CCC conference on the theme of On India, Self-Image and Counter-Image. The speaker who highlighted the significance of CCC in the context of diplomacy was one of our highly reputed foreign secretaries, who is now a life trustee of the India International Center, Shri Saran. I thank you very much for your continued interest in the CCC project. I must now thank the third panelist today, Dr. Oscar Pujol, who is a director of the Cervantes Institute and is a Sanskritist. I met him 7 years ago when we both were taking part in a conference that was organized by the European Union here in Delhi. I must also thank the IIC library, where I sat and saw through the final proofs, and the editorial board for publishing my article with almost the same title as the title of this book this summer in the IIC Quarterly. Finally, I come to the present program director, Tete, who has organized this evening's function in collaboration with the Routledge team. Thank you, Akash Chakravarti, and your team. Well, finally, I must tell you that I was extremely moved when I heard from Tete that Miss Premola Ghosh, who served the IIC for so many years and so well as the head of the program division, had already put the idea of this book launch on the agenda while the book was still in press. I didn't know anything about that. I'm deeply touched. So you know why I have a very special thanks to give to IIC. Well, conversation entails both speaking and careful listening. Given that today we have such a great number of panelists here, I will happily assume the role of listener after thanking you, each one of you, for your presence and your attention. Please read the book.
Thank you, Dr. Balslev, for that very eloquent introduction to your book. Of course, we haven't gone into any of the details of it yet. Now, Senator Pujol, would you like to take the floor? You can speak from here or from there, wherever you like.
Thanks very much, Mr. Karan Singh. Thanks also to Shri Bastava, Mr. Shyam Saran, and Anindita. Thanks very much for counting on me to be here with you on this release of the book. And also one word of remembrance to Premola Ghosh, who was a very, very dear friend of a personal friend and a great collaborator. It was really sad to know that she's no longer with us, but I'm sure she's watching us from wherever she is, and that she will bless this meeting and the release of the book. I think really what Anindita is doing, it is really the need of the hour to have, these cross-cultural conversations. I will try to be brief, but why this book is so necessary today? I often think that we are now going through what I like to call a third globalization. The first globalization took place about 1 century before the Common Era, when commercial routes were open from the Mediterranean up to China, having India as its epicenter. I won't go into it, but then, a lot of exchanges where Europe and Asia were well connected. The second globalization took place during the Renaissance, started by the Portuguese, and new maritime routes, and after the Spaniards, connected all the ports of the world together. And we know that story, it began a few centuries ago, and how, all of a sudden the world became very well interconnected. Now we are facing a third globalization, much more intense in character and in nature. And there is a difference between this one and the former ones, which today, even if there is a lot of physical mobility, we don't need physical mobility to be interconnected. And that's a new thing. The third globalization is taking place not only by sea routes and by air and land, but also through that world, which sometimes it's a very human one because it's created by men and it's the virtual world, right? And that gives us another kind of dimension about globalization. And this globalization has created an encounter between all the cultures of the world, whether willing or unwilling, Muslims, Christians, Jews, Hindus, they are together now. And they are forced to talk to each other and to try, to settle a pattern of life together. And that's why cross-cultural conversation is a need of the hour. This is the first thing I want to point out. At the same time, in the last years, we are witnessing, and Anindita gives a good place in his book about this new phenomenon, which is a little bit frightening. We are written in her very words. We are living in an era which is menaced by worldwide destructive cultural and national wars. We have seen in recent years an increase in chauvinism, in nationalism, in blatant exclusion of the other, in conspicuous absence of conversation. I won't mention the political. We see it in America, we see it in Europe, we see it in Asia. Like nations are facing each other, and they are sometimes standing against each other, trying to preserve their old identities, their old markets, which seems an anachronism. I like to think that this is the last song of the Swan. I mean, changes that are going to happen in the near future are so intense that all nationalities and all religions, are taking a step back, and they are closing themselves in their fortress.
The last song of the Swan is just before it dies.
Yeah, because they're going, the changes are there, yes. and they're just, and that's why, Anindita takes one of the main topics of the book, which I think she really hits the nail, is the problem between nationalism and globalism. We are still, our problems have become global, economy is global, climate change is a global problem, it's not, culture is global, and we are still thinking in terms of nation states. And this is a thing that, I think it's going to be the main theme of this 21st century. We still think in terms of the 20th century when we are already in the 21st century. As I was saying, that's why the idea of CCC, it seems to me that is so relevant and it's so welcome, and we need really to take it very seriously because it is the need of the hour, how to talk between each other. So he says in her book that CCC is about a change among diverse cultural subgroups, not among big groups. There is a diversity of participants, and there is interaction with conventional partners. And that's very important, and I like very much about her suggestion. CCC is about a new way of learning, but even more so is about a new way of unlearning the old prejudices that keep us, in separate spaces. It's a way to start responding differently to all problems, as she says, and is a way of also of softening hard boundaries. That's her proposal, no? Again, another idea, because the book, it's about, I will say, we have in the book a series of ideas which I think can be developed very strongly, and they become tools for this new conversation in the 21st century, which is so important. She says that all of us have multiple social identities. We may belong to one religion, we belong to one country, we are members of certain clubs, and we have certain ideologies, and that these multiple social identities often are, when we enter into conflict with the other, are regarded into a single lens identity. That's to say, we reduce the other to a single identity because we want to make him a Muslim or a Christian, or we want to make an Indian or a Pakistani, and we forget all the multifaceted aspects of each and every personality. And cross-cultural conversation, if I am right, Anindita, is about not forgetting these multifaceted personalities of each of us. I would like just to contribute a little bit to this cross-cultural and conversation by introducing an idea which I think it's clear, you know. There is a sense sometimes in Europe that multicultural societies are in crisis, that they are somehow not working well as we expected. We've seen in Europe recently a reaction against that multiculturalism, no? And I would say that not against, but more complementing the idea of multicultural societies, and that's part also of just to contribute to your ideas, we should start thinking in terms of multicultural subjects and not societies. What is a multicultural subject? A multicultural subject is a person who has interiorized the codes of one or more different cultures. And I think this tallies very well with India and with how Indian people are, no? I see young Indian people, you know, they will have all the codes of traditional India, they will be performing their pujas in their villages, and next week they will fly to Silicon Valley and they will know all the codes of modern society. And they're able to understand both the modern West and the traditional India. This could be said for many peoples of the world today. Being able, you know, to interiorize and to know and to embody different codes at the same time is the need of the hour. We must learn to be European and Indian at the same time. We must be able to be able to be a scientific and a religious person. We must be able to be a person traditional who understands the law, the traditional law of his country, and at the same time he is completely engaged in modern conversation. I won't take much longer. I think we have many more panelists, but I would just like to finish this with another idea of Anindita, that we should strive to build larger identities. That's one of the main themes, no? Yes. This is like Russian dolls, and I think human people are able, because we have that flexibility of the human mind, that we can be, for instance, I am a Catalan, and I am a Spaniard, and I am a European. I've been a long time in India, and sometimes I feel also, if I am not by birth, I understand also the Indian mind. So to have all these multiple identities like a Russian doll without compromising each other is the hour of the day, is the need of the day, sorry, and is one of the requisites that Anindita puts to have conversational partners in this cross-cultural conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Pujol. Shyam? Shyam Saran.
Respected Dr. Karan Singh, Mr. Oscar Pujol, Anindita ji, and Director of the India International Center, Mr. Srivastava, very distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Let me first of all congratulate Anindita ji for the publication of this very erudite book that she has written on cross-cultural conversation. As she has pointed out, this is actually one of the way stops in a long journey that she has been undertaking, and I'm sure there will be many more in the future. But she was kind enough to invite me to one of the conferences on cross-cultural conversation. And for me, it was a very intriguing experience, because she asked me to relate this to the profession of diplomacy. What role does cross-cultural conversation play in terms of the practice of diplomacy? And what earlier I had been thinking about is that in our profession, in diplomacy, culture is actually a very underrated asset. When we conduct diplomacy relations between states, it is very much government to government or institution to institution. But sometimes we forget that actually one of the most powerful ways of reaching out to another country is in fact through cultural exchanges. Because I think one of the important things to remember is that culture by its very nature, whether it is music or whether it is dance or it is painting or sculpture, speaks in a universal language. People from very different societies with different identities can still appreciate and in fact imbibe what they are seeing as the cultural expression of another country. And I think this, perhaps many of us diplomats do not perhaps realize that you actually possess a very powerful tool to be able to influence countries that you are dealing with. So this is one aspect. The other is, in my own profession, I have found that successful diplomacy is very much related to having a cultural empathy. Whether it is a country with which you have adversarial relations or whether it is a country with which you have very friendly relations, in order to successfully deal with that country, it is extremely important to have a sense of empathy for the culture that you are encountering when you are serving in the country. Because this gives you some sense of what is even if there are differences in perspective, perhaps those differences in perspectives can actually be a source of creativity for yourself, a means of broadening your own understanding, not necessarily specific to this culture or that culture. So one of the examples that I gave in the conference that we had and where I spoke, I pointed to my experience in learning Mandarin, Chinese, because that was my language when I went into the service. And when I was doing the course, I used to always get into a major difficulty with one concept, which is of time. So, in generally in our culture and even in Western culture, you look at the future as being something in front of you. You look at the past as something being behind you. In Chinese, the day which is in front of you, the term used for it is behind day. And the day which has already passed is actually the day in front of you. So I used to make this mistake all the time, because whenever this term came, when I was trying to refer to the future, I would be using the term which actually in Chinese referred to the past, and vice versa. So my teacher at some point got rather upset and said, why are you making this mistake all the time? It's a simple concept for you to understand. So I was a little supercilious maybe, and I said, well, most people look at the future as being in front and the past being behind. This is a rather strange way of looking at time. So she looked a little puzzled and said, but why? Because past is something which you have experienced. Therefore it is in front of you. You already know what has happened. It is the future which you do not know about. So logically it is behind you. So when it was explained like this to me, you suddenly realize, well, there is some logic to this. Now, when you come across this kind of an experience, what does it do? It makes you respectful of other viewpoints, because you suddenly realize that many of the assumptions which you make and you think others are wrong, actually they also have a certain point. So I think cross-cultural communication in that sense is a very deeper concept. And there is one aspect which is conversation, but the other more important aspect is culture, because it is culture which makes that conversation possible. Now, of course, Anindita has a chapter on nationalism and globalization, and it is a paradox, isn't it, that today's world, most of the challenges which we are facing, whether it is climate change, whether it is global public health issues, cyber security, all these are challenges which cannot be dealt with with only national intervention or even regional intervention. The very nature of these challenges are such that you need a global and you need a collaborative response. Now, the paradox is that precisely at a time when you need those kind of cross-national and also global kind of responses, in fact, the world is fragmenting. We are going in the opposite direction. There is a reaction, as has been pointed out, to the whole process of globalization. The spirit of internationalism has been put aside, and narrow nationalism has started surfacing, not only in Europe, but also we see in our own country. Now, if we are looking at somehow reversing globalization, that is not possible, because globalization is driven by technological change. And we are not ready to give up our iPads and our mobile telephones because this has now become embedded in our daily lives. So you're not willing to give that up. So globalization will continue to take place, and the only way in which you can deal with globalization is through international governance, through multilateralism, and multilateralism really is an expression of internationalism. Without that, you cannot hope to deal with these issues. So I suppose we'll have to go through this phase before we come back to the awareness that in fact we have to move towards cross border institutions and governance systems. Lastly, I would like to point out that what is the great importance of cross-cultural conversations? Why is it necessary to really go beyond what we see as identities, which you have mentioned, and look at a larger humanity which unites us together? Now, what has happened today is that we are really, one of the very adverse impacts of the so-called war against terrorism has been that there has been a pervasive kind of a fear which has taken hold in our societies. And so, in a very perhaps it's not always visible that we are becoming complicit ourselves in the limitation of our own rights, limitations of our own entitlements, because we think it is necessary in order to keep us safe. So this, where security has become the most important objective, at the cost of, in fact, our rights. And this is where the kind of conversations that you have, you are not able to have those conversations because when earlier, if you came across a stranger, that encounter was pregnant with possibilities, with perhaps a new way of looking at things. But today, you will not have that kind of a interaction because you're afraid. The stranger could be actually a source of danger. So once that kind of a prejudice takes hold, then how do we have cross-cultural conversation? So I think it is very important that we should have a deeper reflection of some of these issues, and I would like to compliment Anindita ji for actually raising some of these very important issues at a time perhaps where not many people are willing to look at some of these issues. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you, Shyam, for your very interesting comments. This book, although it looks slender, it's so full of ideas and it's so pregnant with meaning. We could organize a dozen seminars out of each chapter of these books. And lots of the issues that have been mentioned are issues that I personally have been involved in over the last half century at least. And I would love to dwell at length on all of them, but I can't do that. That will take you till midnight. So I'll very quickly skim over what I consider to be the most significant of these problems. The first, of course, has been mentioned now, is globalization versus nationalism. Towards the end of the last century, Shyam, if you recall, it seemed as if we were moving towards some kind of a global society. There were regional organizations developing very well. European Union, for example, it was a miracle. And the battlefields of Europe, the French, the British, and the Germans killed each other for thousands of years. Thousands of people perished on the fields of Europe. And suddenly we see the franc disappears, the lira disappears, the mark disappears, the European Union, the euro comes into being. It was a miracle. It was really something which I thought we would never see in our lifetime. So the European Union was there, ASEAN was there, SARC was beginning to develop, and I remember myself going around the world talking about the importance of globalization and how we've got to develop a global consciousness if we are to come to grips with the new global society. Unfortunately, in the 21st century, there has been a blowback. And that is the result of two black swan events. I'm sure the audience knows what a black swan event is. A black swan event is an entirely unexpected event with momentous consequences. I'll repeat that, an entirely unexpected event with momentous consequences. There's a book called Black Swan because everybody said swans are always white, and no, somebody said, I've seen a black swan. So there's a book called The Black Swan. Now, what are these two black swan events? The first is Brexit. Who would have thought that the British, who we assumed were reasonably intelligent people, would suddenly get into a situation where, they're just torn apart? Why that Cameron had to suddenly announce a referendum, which he needn't have done? And look at the way, from one small mistake, how the whole thing has developed. Not only is Great Britain itself torn, but the structure of the European Union has been shaken. Because Great Britain is one of the foundations, Britain, France and Germany, the three big countries in the European Union. So with Brexit, it has not only threatened the unity of the United Kingdom, it has also threatened the whole European Union, which to our mind was one of the most successful and brilliant developments. So that was the first which is totally unexpected. And look at the consequences. The second one, of course, was the election of President Trump. Who would have thought that the Americans would elect Trump? I mean, I don't want to go into that in any great detail. It's obvious. So you have now a person who's not only not globalized, he's anti-global. He's said, I'm not a globalized. I don't believe in globalization. It's a wrong idea. I believe in nationalism. He said that. He's trashed international agreements, well-established international agreements. He has withdrawn from the Paris Agreement on climate change, which, as you know, was with great difficulty. We came to some kind of a consensus. He's pulled out of that. He's created havoc around the world. So you suddenly have these two. That again was a black swan. Who would have thought that he got elected and that he would do these sort of things? So these two events between them have really given a blowback. And as Shyam mentioned, now there's a sort of anti-globalization thing going. So how are we going to deal with this problem is something which we have to really very seriously do. The whole concept of whether nationalism should necessarily be in competition with globalization is a very interesting thing. As has been mentioned, I think we have never been a society which is only interested in nationalism. Our great thinkers, Rabindranath Tagore, for example, wrote a long essay against nationalism, you remember. Mahatma Gandhi's teachings were not confined to India, they were international teachings. Even Sri Aurobindo, the very prophet of Indian nationalism, towards the end of his life he had said that nationalism would have run its course and we would move on to the next, if you see his last message on Independence Day. And so India had this capacity to be both Indian as well as to be... here again you have then the question of multiple identities. Now, in my own lifetime, I've been through a series of identities, all of them involved with a language. Let me put before you this. It's a classic case, an instance of how language can develop windows to new identities. My first language that I learned was Dogri, because my ethnic identity is I'm a Dogra. contrary to public opinion that I'm a Kashmiri, I'm not a Kashmiri, I'm a Dogra. And the Dogras are a small community in North India, but they have their own special, they have their language. It is in the 8th schedule now. And I learnt from my mother, who was also from Himachal, she's a Dogra. I learnt all these Dogri songs and the Dogri language. My father, we spoke Dogri. That is my first identity, therefore, was through Dogri as a Dogra. The language of the erstwhile state, I must now use that phrase, of Jammu and Kashmir, the regional language is Urdu. Now through Urdu, it opened a whole new identity. When one read the poems, you read the poems of Ghalib, Faiz Saab, whom I happened to meet, who came to Delhi to my house, is so kind, and so all the other things, that opened up a whole new realm of awareness. That is sort of, in a way, some kind of a regional identity for us. Then Hindi. That brought about yet another identity as a Hindi-speaking person. So the whole world of Hindi and the world of Hindi literature opened up, and the millions and millions of people who speak Hindi. Then, of course, English, which is a world language. I do not agree that English is a foreign language. It's as much an Indian language as anything else. I think the way Indians have used English is probably much better than the ways the English have done that. At least the recent, all our leaders, if you read Sri Aurobindo, for example, or you read Jawaharlal Nehru, or you read even Mahatma Gandhi, and I mean the way they used English, that is the window to the world. So Dogri was my ethnic identity. Urdu was my regional identity. Hindi was a broader sub-national identity. English was my identity as a global citizen. Because when I learnt English, I was not only an Indian. I was a global citizen, because I could read into the works, either directly or in translation, of people from all over the world. And then Sanskrit, which is my cultural identity. The glorious world, which opens up a whole vista of wisdom and of knowledge and of power, intellectual and spiritual power. So with each one of these languages, I had another identity. So as I said, in my own life, I've moved through multiple identities. So now what we have to realize, that if we are going to at all survive on this planet, we have to accept and welcome multiple identities. If we get stuck only on one identity, I can say I'm only an Indian, okay, but I'm not only an Indian. On the one hand, I'm a Dogra, on the other hand, I'm a global citizen. So these various identities have to somehow or the other be integrated. And my view, which I've been expressing over the years, has been that it is only a strong spiritual center around which these identities can be harmonized. If you have a strong center, then they are like concentric circles. Doesn't matter how many circles you have, your center remains firm. But if your center starts shifting with each identity, then you become eccentric, you become neurotic, and that's what we are seeing around us now. There's so much violence in the name of identities now. I mean, they are becoming counterproductive. Each one of the identities that I mentioned could become counterproductive. So that's the other thing. The third thing, for example, is the whole thing of science and religion. I mean, that is again fascinating. I mean, the idea, there's a very nice quote, I think, from Dr. Radhakrishnan, where he says that when people speak of conflict between science and religion, they do not appreciate the spiritual character of science and the rational character of religion. You see, this is again a whole, now the cutting edge is consciousness research, which is the cutting edge between religion and science and how we work. That's another whole area which one can go into, but which has also been covered in this book. Then there are the whole question of generational tensions, touched upon, not covered in detail, generational tensions. We had assumed that the younger generation would be more liberal and more democratic than us. I don't think that is the case.
No.
I'm sorry to say, I don't know what the audience thinks, but I'm finding that the younger generations are getting more and more inward looking rather than becoming members of the global society. This is astonishing and rather disturbing. Because you would have thought that young people who were born in the global age, born after when the global age began, I suppose, with the invention of the mobile telephone. I mean, people who were born with that, grew up with that, they would have been more open to the world of ideas around, but no, not so. There's a lot, I mean, I'm not saying that all young people are like that, but there is a clear thing that the generation is not becoming more liberal. That is again an important source of tension. And then there's, of course, the question of artificial intelligence. Now, Stephen Hawking and Steve Jobs, I mean, no less than two of the most important people of our times, have said that in their view, artificial intelligence represents the greatest threat to humanity ever. Now, if Stephen Hawking is saying that, for God's sake, I mean, he's beyond the cutting edge of knowledge, what does that mean? Are we aware at all of what is happening? Are we aware of how this is going to transform, maybe not in our lifetime, but in the next 10, 15, 20 years, is going to transform the texture of civilization? So these are all fascinating areas which need to be. And finally, I'd like to say that when knowledge grows but wisdom languishes, that is serious. The Mundaka Upanishad talks of the two types of knowledge, the Paravidya and the Aparavidya. The Paravidya is the vidya that all of these things, all science, technology, everything we learn, geography, history, commerce, so on. Paravidya is the knowledge of the divine. So what I'm trying to say is that unless we are able to somehow or the other, as it were, include a higher dimension of thought in our consciousness, I don't think it's going to work. Because now we have so many disparate aspects that are at pace. You know, there are two scenarios for the future of the human race. I discussed this with Anindita 2 or 3 times. Arthur Koestler, who was a European philosopher, as you know, from Central Europe, he holds that the human race is a race programmed for self-destruction because of an engineering defect in the cortex, whereby the thinking and the feeling elements are not adequately combined. So although we know what is right, we don't do it. Like Duryodhana says, Janami dharman nacha me nivritti, pravritti, janami dharman nacha me nivritti. I know what is right, but I'm not attracted to it. I know what is wrong, but I'm attracted to it. So is there a defect in the cortex? So Koestler says sooner or later the human race is bound to blow itself. There's no question about it. As against that, Sri Aurobindo and the evolutionary philosophers say, Aurobindo particularly, that the human race is a race programmed for evolution. In the same way as we've evolved from the mineral to the vegetable to the aquatic, then to the animal, then to the human, there's no reason to believe that evolution is complete. Humanity is now a creature halfway between the animal and the divine. And given time, we will evolve into a higher form of consciousness. Inevitably, we are programmed for that. So both of these theories are before you, the jury is out. The only thing is one doesn't know what's going to happen. It reminds me of a limerick that I learned a long time ago, which says, God's plan made a hopeful beginning, but man spoiled his chances by sinning. We know that the story will end in God's glory, but at present the other side's winning. So, वो खाक हो जाएंगे तुमको खबर होने तक, by the time we evolve, will we still be there? And as somebody said to me, when I made this speech in a university, a young boy got up and said, "It's possible. Both are true. We may be evolving towards our own destruction." It's a very interesting thing that he said, because artificial intelligence is evolution. And that really set me thinking. I thought that was a brilliant remark. He said, both are true. we are evolving, but we are evolving towards our destruction. So both Aurobindo and Khosla are true. In any case, let me say that Anindita has done a marvelous job in this book. She has compressed a wealth of learning and of erudition into a very, very readable, very important summary, as it were, of these things. And she has postulated cross-cultural conversation as a methodology of bridging the gap. There I do think that she's slightly optimistic, if I may put it mildly, because she seems to feel, I know that carefully constructed cross-cultural conversations are very valuable. As Shyam has pointed out, I've attended many of the ones that she's done. But whether in the view of this tremendous problem that we have, whether these are going to be sufficient or whether they can even make a dent on it, I do not know. But what we have to do is we have to involve ourselves in these conversations.
Worth trying.
Well, it's worth trying. It needs to be tried, because unless we try, unless we make an attempt, then we're just getting washed away by the mart of events. And so I think what we have to do is, the importance of what she said is that these cross-cultural conversations have to be there, structured, cutting across academia and civil society, cutting across the generations, and then we can see where we are moving towards. So I can only, on behalf of all of you, I would very much like to congratulate Anindita for her work. We have at present, of course, these international structures. I'm not even going into that. But they do not fulfill the thing that we wanted to. The United Nations, for example, has stuck in 1945. It's frozen. UNESCO, with which I was involved for many years, is doing a little better, I think. It's doing some useful things. For example, Hyderabad has now become a special city for its gastronomy, which I thought was a very good idea, you know. Delicious Noor Jahani pulaus and all that. It makes one's mouth water. But, and Jaipur, for example, is for handicrafts. I think Banaras is for music. So it's a very interesting thing that UNESCO is doing, these special cities programs. So some organizations are doing very well. The specialized agencies, WHO and so on, they're doing very well. Although the United Nations itself is frozen. But
Not enough funds.
there's not enough, and there's not enough money, therefore, even for cross-cultural conversations. I haven't even mentioned the interfaith movement with which I am involved, in which I've been working on for half a century. So what we need is, I think, first of all, a better understanding of the problems that we face. Because unless we grasp the immensity and diversity of the problems before us, we will not be able to tackle them. And then for us, each one in our own way, to make efforts to try and bring about a better world in the future. So thank you very much. Congratulations, Anindita, for your job. And thank you, the audience, for coming here on this terrible, foggy day with even and odd. And have a good trip home. Good night.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. 7:30. 90 minutes as I had budgeted.
Wonderful.